Have you ever wished you could create something beautiful with your own hands? Maybe you've dreamed of sewing, but it felt intimidating, or you didn't know where to start. Maybe you forgot that knowledge from your home ec class in the 8th grade. Well, you are in the right place because today I'm going to show you just how simple and rewarding sewing can be, even if you've never touched a sewing machine before. Sewing isn't just a skill, it's a way to slow down, be present, and make something truly special with your own hands. And the best part is you don't need years of experience to begin. All you need is a little guidance and the willingness to just start, and you'll want a sewing machine which you can borrow from a family, friend, or loved one. So first, let's walk through the essentials that you'll need to start sewing. It's easy to think you need every fancy gadget and tool, and specialty tools can definitely have their place. But when you're just getting started, simple is better. You want to remove every obstacle in your way from just beginning. You can create beautiful projects with just a few key supplies. So here is what I recommend. First, you want a sewing machine and a great pair of fabric scissors, which we'll talk about later. You'll also need a seam ripper, pins or clips, a rotary cutter, which is also optional, measuring tape or a straight edge, an iron. You'll need matching thread, and you'll also need fabric. Let's dive more into each thing that you need, but first I'm going to share about our sponsor because it goes perfectly in hand with what we're talking about. Favorite sewing tool brands, and that's LDH scissors. I have been using LDH scissors for many years now, and I am a big fan. I remember buying my first pair of fabric shears from them and just being amazed with the quality and how beautiful these scissors are. They are ones that are going to last forever. So LDH stands for love, dedication, and happiness, which I think encompasses sewing and the act of putting your hand to something valuable and building something with your own two hands. It's a family-run company that is currently run by the second generation, which is something that I love to see. I love to support brands that are carrying on a family legacy, and that's carrying on a craft like sewing or creating. All of their products have a 10-year warranty, and they are top of the line. My favorite products from LDH are their fabric shears. I have the Midnight edition because it's all black. They are the perfect weight in your hand. They cut super smooth and sharp. And I also love the rotary cutter. The thread snips are my favorite. And I also love their pinking shears and their new scallop shears. So pinking shears are one of those things that I would put in the next tier of tools that you'll want when sewing. Just come in handy. They are so versatile. I use them on nearly every project that I make. And they're one of those like hidden heroes in my sewing toolbox. LDH is sponsoring today's video, and I'm so thankful for their partnership and their products because I've sincerely been using them for years. So when you're looking for a sewing machine, you want something pretty basic. You don't need anything with a ton of bells and whistles. You really just need a well-working machine that has a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch, a speed regulator, and it's also nice to have a buttonhole presser foot if that's available to you. I recommend looking for a machine that has a top-loading bobbin. This means that the bobbin is where you can see it through like a clear case, and you'll be able to tell when the bobbin is running out. Sometimes it's on the side or the front of the machine, and this can just make it a little bit confusing, and you might be sewing for a while before you realize that the bobbin ran out, and that can be frustrating. So if you can, try to find one with a top-loading bobbin. I love the Baby Lock brand. It's something I've sewn with for years. My machine has lasted 12 years, and when you take care of your machine by keeping it clean and getting it serviced regularly, then it's going to last you. Like with anything, if you take good care of it, it's going to take good care of you. I already shared about my favorite fabric shears, but I definitely recommend just having a great pair of fabric scissors that you don't use for anything else but cutting fabric. So you'll also need just a pair of scissors for cutting paper if you're using patterns. And if you like, a rotary cutter is nice to have when cutting a lot of fabric or straight lines. You also want pins or clips. This is going to keep your fabric in place while sewing. You can also use this while cutting patterns out. It just keeps things secure without moving things around when you're trying to cut and sew. You can also use clips if that's something you prefer. I think everyone has a different preference, but pins are what I've always used. And I also like having a magnetic pin dish to make sure that they're not going all over the place. You also need a seam ripper. This is going to come in handy with your sewing journey. And just remember that using a seam ripper is part of the process. It does not define you. It does not mean you failed if you need to rip out a seam. It's just something that you're going to have to do. When you're using a seam ripper, just always remember that the red tip goes under the stitches. And as you pull the fabric tightly, keep the seam ripper lined up on the stitches. It's going to glide so much easier, and it's going to kind of take that painful process out of the seam ripping because you're not having to take out each little stitch. You're able to glide it over those stitches easily. This does take practice, but you're going to have a lot of instances where you need a seam rip, and each time it's going to just imprint those lessons along the way into your brain, and that is how you learn. You also need measuring tape. I recommend having a pliable measuring tape that you can use to measure yourself if you're sewing garments. Also, you can use this for measuring your seam allowances, and I also would recommend getting a straight edge if you're using a rotary cutter. I love using a straight edge in most of my cuts. It just helps me make sure everything is lined up and straight. You'll also need an iron. If you have a home iron, that is perfect. Going to take your sewing project from average to something that is great and really just stands out. And finally, you need fabric. When you're just starting, I recommend going to the fabric store if you have one in your area and just getting quilter's cotton. This is easy to sew with. It's not going to be finicky and hard to sew. It's going to be a great place to start. And you can also go to the thrift store. You can get a lot of fabric for a small amount of money. And this is a great way to practice and not feel like you are wasting any fabric. And you can also give these sheets a new life. Like with any new hobby or something that you're learning, you're going to come across terms that you see everywhere, and you might be wondering, what does this mean? So here are a few terms that you need to know when sewing. The first is right sides together. This means that there is a pretty side of the fabric and the back side of the fabric, the part that's going to be on the inside that you don't see and the end product. So for here, I have this cotton fabric, and there's floral print on the outside, which would be the right side, and the back, which is the wrong side, has more muddy colors. It's not as defined, and you can see a difference between the right side and the wrong side. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to recognize what the right and wrong side is, but you want to identify this before making any cuts to your fabric. So to sew the right sides together, you want to lay your fabric on a table with the right side facing up. And when it says to do right sides together, that means you're going to take your next piece of fabric and lay it on top with the right side facing down, and you'll be able to see the wrong side facing up. So this means when you sew the edge together, that edge is going to be on the inside of the garment or the project piece, and it won't be shown on the outside. That seam will be hidden. A seam allowance is something you're going to be reading in patterns and projects. You want to know your seam allowance so you know how much fabric you have to work with when sewing. So the seam allowance is the distance between where the needle is to the edge of the fabric. This can vary for each project depending on what you're sewing. So usually it's 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And this is going to just make sure everything's lining up and fitting properly. So be sure to double check your seam allowance when sewing. Next, the hem. This is the bottom of a shirt or pants. It might also be the bottom of a sleeve. A hem is where you're enclosing the raw edge of the fabric and finishing this nicely. A top stitch is a decorative stitch that is seen from the outside of the garment, and it's going to hold the fabric in place while also being decorative. So you want to make sure that when you are doing a top stitch that your thread is coordinating colors and it's also as straight as you can make it. Before we dive in, it is really helpful to get familiar with your sewing machine. We're going to break it down step by step. So my machine will be different from yours, but I'm going to show you what it looks like on threading my machine so that you get a good gist of what it looks like. And hopefully this helps translate to your own machine. But I definitely recommend referring to your user manual and checking on how to thread your own machine. So first, I put the thread on the spool and then put the spool cap on and take the thread and weave it through the machine following the steps. So I'm going to go over and down, around, up through a hook, and make sure that the thread is getting on the hook. And then I'm going to go down behind this little slot right above the needle and then thread it through the needle. When you pull your thread out, you want to pull it to the back of the machine and make sure you have an inch or two to make sure that it doesn't get caught back into the machine. For winding the bobbin, first you want an empty bobbin and you're going to insert that on your machine. And then for me, I click the bobbin over in place and wind a little bit of the thread around the bobbin, following the numbers on my machine that tell me where to thread the bobbin. Then I hold it in place as I press down the presser foot and it automatically starts winding the bobbin. And once it's full, I remove the bobbin, and to insert it, I unlock this little latch and set my bobbin inside and bring the bobbin around where it shows me on my machine, and then put the latch back in place. Again, I want to bring some of this thread to the back. To do this, I'm going to turn the wheel on the side of my machine towards me, and this is going to take the top thread, weave it down through the bobbin, and I'm going to hold this in place and pull it to the back of the machine so that the bobbin thread comes out. This will help it just get started for when you sew, it doesn't get caught into the machine. Most machines have diagrams and numbers to show you where each thread goes to make sure that it is running smoothly. So for the basic stitches, there is a straight stitch and a back stitch, and these are your go-tos. So for a straight stitch, this is the default stitch for most sewing machines and sewing. And to start, you're going to press gently on the presser foot. And this is when I would recommend to turn down the speed on your machine while you're getting used to and comfortable with the sewing machine. So just like you're driving a car, press gently on the gas per se and press the pedal a little bit down, and you'll start to see the machine moving. And as you take about 2 stitches, you're going to stop and find your back stitch. So maybe that's a handle, or for me, it's a button on my machine right here. I'm going to press this down and it's going to do a back stitch. It's going to reinforce the seam at the start and the end of your sewing project. So I'm going to back stitch, and then I am going to release my hand from this button and keep sewing forward a straight stitch. So you can go really slow here, and with 2 hands on the fabric, you're just going to gently guide this through the machine. You're not going to push, you're not going to pull the fabric in any way. Your hands are gently touching the fabric, guiding it where to go next. What I like to do is I like to look at the side of the fabric, so where just the edge of the fabric is. I like to watch that as I'm sewing to make sure that the presser foot is gently grazing beside this edge, and this helps me feel like I have more control of where the fabric is going. And of course, as you keep sewing, you're going to get more used to it, and it's going to be a lot smoother and faster. You can carefully increase the speed of your sewing machine as you get more comfortable. So with this knowledge, let's sew a straight line. Here is a simple step-by-step. First, like I said, turn down the speed on your sewing machine if it has that option. Next, place your fabric under the presser foot. So usually there is a lever and you're going to lift this up for the presser foot to be raised. Gently glide your fabric under the presser foot, making sure you're keeping about a 1/2 inch seam allowance between the needle and the edge of the fabric, and lower the presser foot and the needle. So your machine probably has a button or a lever that will lower the needle as well. So gently press the pedal like you're driving and guide the fabric straight without pulling or pushing. So let the machine do most of the work. At the start and end of your line, make sure you're backstitching 2 to 3 stitches to lock in this stitch. And if you want to turn corners, you're going to stop with the needle down, lift up the presser foot, pivot the fabric, lower the foot, and keep going. Repeat this as needed. And remember, your stitches don't have to be perfect. The most important thing is that you're practicing and getting comfortable. If you're not comfortable with using fabric, I love to just take the thread out of the machine for this step and take out the bobbin, and you can practice on paper. You can draw shapes and make you more comfortable. Now that you are familiar with your machine, we're going to talk about fabric basics. So here are a few quick tips to get you started. First, you want to pre-wash your fabric. You always want to pre-wash and dry your fabric before sewing. This is going to help prevent shrinkage, and it's going to soften your fabric. I think you'll be surprised with what that first wash will do to your fabric. It'll make it much softer, more pliable, and it will give you a more accurate view of what your finished garment will look like, because maybe it was stiff at first, but each wash is going to loosen those fibers and get them more comfortable. And you want to make sure that you're going to wash them and dry them as you will once you are finished with your product. So if you are making a dress, I would recommend washing the fabric as normal in your washing machine and hang drying the fabric before sewing. And then from here on out, when you wash your dress, you want to make sure that you are hanging it to dry. This is just going to make sure nothing is shrinking along the way. And then next, you want to iron your fabric before cutting. It lays flatter and it ensures an accurate cut to your pattern piece. Here I have a few fabrics that I want to walk you through and show you some differences about. First, this is a linen. This is before it has been washed, so it's still a little bit stiff, and as I wash it, it's going to get softer. You can see that the threads are woven together, so it's pretty difficult to see what the wrong side and the right side is. But if you look closely, it is a beautiful fabric to work with. It is going to last. It is a natural fiber and something I love to sew with. If you're just starting, you may want to wait a little bit until you start using linen so you get more comfortable with sewing and cutting. Next, we have a cotton. This is what I would recommend you starting with. This is an organic floral print cotton. You can see that the right side and wrong side are easier to determine because the right side is brighter and you can see that the print is more defined. This is something that I love to use for many different projects, whether that's something I'm going to wear, a blanket, bias binding on a jacket. I've used it for many different things. Cotton is also a natural fiber, so I always recommend looking for natural fibers when possible. Next, this is a cotton gauze. I wanted to show this to you because it is currently a really popular fabric to sew with, and it can be a little bit more difficult when you're just starting out because it is made up of many different layers that are thin and can snag easily. This can be a little frustrating to sew with if you're just starting out. It is a beautiful fabric. It is really versatile. I like to use it in dresses or children's clothes or blankets. As you wash it, it creates this bubble texture, which is unique. It is a fun fabric to use. And then I wanted to show you an example of a stretch. This is a jersey fabric, and I was gravitated towards it because of the print. It can feel really alluring to want to make your first project with a stretch fabric, but I want to warn you and just say maybe wait until you have a few projects under your belt before using a stretch. When you do use a stretch fabric, I always recommend using a stretch needle, Seriflex thread, which is a thread that you can use with a regular sewing machine, or if you have a serger or overlocker, that is the best way to sew a stretch fabric. So even though your eye may be gravitated towards the cotton gauzes and the stretch fabrics at first, I want to just give you a little bit of a heads up so that you start with something that's going to set you up for success like 100% cotton will. You want to know about fabric is when you buy a fabric, you want to know the grain line. So the grain line is the direction of the fabric threads. So when you cut along the grain line, this keeps your project stable and laying as it's supposed to. You want this to be parallel to the selvage edge. So if your pattern piece has a grain line that is 2 arrows pointing up and down, you're going to line up this grain line parallel to the selvage edge. And so this, as you can see, I'm pulling it up and down. It's not really stretching. It's not really giving a lot. When I stretch it the opposite way, it's still not really stretching. But you can see when I pull it diagonally, this is called the bias. This is where the fabric has more of a stretch. You're going to use this around curves or binding, or there are patterns that use bias to its advantage. It's going to be more flowy and airy, have more movement to the garment. So you always want to be mindful of the grain line when you're cutting your fabric, because if you go opposite to the grain line, it's going to look a little bit wonky and stiff when you're wearing your piece. The selvage edge is the manufactured edge on the side of your fabric. You'll see this as a bolt of fabric is being unrolled. You can see that finished edge on the side. You always want to line up your grain line parallel to it. A perfect first project is a pillow cover. This is going to teach you some of the basics of sewing, and you'll end up with a product that you're proud of and can display in your home and say, look, I made that. To make an envelope pillowcase, you'll need cotton fabric, matching thread, scissors, measuring tape, pins, a sewing machine, and an iron. For my fabric, I found this cotton fabric at Hobby Lobby. It has a good amount of weight to it where it's not too flimsy and it's really simple to sew. When you go to the fabric store, you pick out your fabric that you like and take it up to the counter for them to cut. They're going to ask you, how much fabric do you need? For this cover, I needed 1.5 yards. This is going to give me plenty of fabric to work with, and from this amount, I can make 2 pillow covers. So the width of my pillow is 22 inches, and that is how wide I'm going to make my cover because I want it to have a snug fit on my pillow. First, measure and cut the fabric. To determine your fabric size, measure your pillow insert. Cut 1 piece of fabric with the following measurements. For the width, this will be the same as the pillow insert. So my pillow is 22 inches, so I want to cut the width of my fabric 22 inches wide. For the length, I'm going to measure 2 times the pillow height and add 8 inches minimum for the envelope overlap. I say 8 inches minimum because if I have way more fabric, I'm going to just use this up. It's going to make it easier, and it's going to make sure that my envelope closes all the way. So for this piece, all I needed to do is measure 22 inches wide and follow this stripe and cut all the way down the fabric. Step number 2 is hem the short edges. On each short end of the fabric, fold the edge 1/2 inch to the wrong side and press. Fold it over another 1/2 inch and press it again. Now you're going to take this to your sewing machine, and you can see that the pressed edges are towards the wrong side, but I'm going to start sewing from the right side. This is called a top stitch. So I'm going to put it under my presser foot, lower the presser foot, make sure everything is lined up 1/2 inch from the side of the fabric, and then I'm going to start sewing just a couple stitches and then back stitch, and then keep sewing until I reach the opposite end. I'm going to back stitch again and then remove this from the machine. Step number 3 is fold and pin. So lay the fabric right side up on a flat surface. Fold one end towards the center and now fold the opposite end over this fold. This will create an overlapping flap in the middle. Adjust the overlap so the final folded shape matches the pillow's dimensions. So I want to make sure that it is measuring 22 inches here. Now pin the side seams to hold everything in place and take it to your sewing machine. Step number 4 is to sew the side seams. Sew along both side edges using 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're going to do exactly what you did before and backstitch at the beginning and end to make sure that these stitches are locked in place. Step number 5, trim and finish. Now clip the corners, and this will help reduce bulk and make sure that when you turn everything right side out, those corners will be crisp. If you would like, you can use your zigzag stitch here and you can sew right along the raw edge of the fabric. This will help just make sure that nothing unravels. Step number 6, turn and press. So turn the pillow cover right side out through the envelope opening. Use a point turner or your fingers to shape the corners neatly. Now, if you need to, you can press the cover for a crisp finish. Finally, insert the pillow. Slip the pillow insert through the back opening and adjust the fabric to make sure everything is laying really neatly. And there you have it, a super simple pillow cover and your first sewing project. Sewing is a rewarding hobby to have, and I hope that this just sets you up for success in your sewing journey. If you want some more beginner sewing projects, then click the next video for inspiration.